pick up where we left off in John chapter 4 last time, when Jesus had this conversation with this Samaritan woman that he met by the side of a well near the city of Sychar in Samaria, a place that Jews usually would not go. Jesus and his disciple, all Jews, were passing through. His disciples had gone into town to get provisions. They've been traveling from Judea en route to Galilee. Upon arriving in Galilee, Jesus would begin what we usually call his great Galilean ministry, which is the focus of attention in the other Gospels. Almost all the miracles and almost all the preaching and parables and so forth that we have in the other Gospels took place during his Galilean ministry. Up to this point, John has not even gotten us that far into the life of Christ. John alone supplies this earlier material of things Jesus did before the Galilean ministry. But he's on his way there, and before the end of this chapter, he actually does a miracle in Galilee and thus launches that season that will be the focus of the other Gospels, but not so much of this one. In talking to this woman who came to draw water, he had begun by asking her to give him water, and she was surprised to hear such a request since he was a Jew and she was a Samaritan, and there was no love between the Jews and the Samaritans. They usually despised each other. Also, it was uncommon for a man to speak to a woman in public in that culture. Women would stay at home most of the time, and when they had to go out, they'd ignore the men and go back home. The rabbis thought it was not safe for a man to talk to a woman. In fact, the rabbis had a saying, do not speak long with a woman, even your own wife. And especially not another man's wife. That was a rabbinic saying of the time. So Jesus kind of broke custom in two ways, in speaking to a woman and in speaking to a Samaritan. It was the latter that surprised her most. She said, why are you asking me for water when you're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan, and Jews don't have anything to do? They have no dealings with Samaritans. They don't share anything in common. They don't share water vessels, certainly, to drink from. And Jesus, ignored her question more or less and said, if you had known the gift of God and who it was who asked you for a drink of water, you would have really been the one who'd asked me. And I would have given you living water. And she said, well, I don't see how you get any water. You don't have a bucket or a rope, and this is a deep well. She thought when he said living water, he was referring to the running water at the bottom of that artesian well, which is known to be such because it's still there today, and it does have a spring at its bottom. So there is what they would have called in those days living water at the bottom. It was fresh, flowing water. And she thought he was offering to give her water from the bottom of the well, and he had nothing to draw with. She said, you don't have anything to draw with. The well's deep. How are you going to give me this living water? And then he changed up the conversation a little bit to make it clear that he was talking about something other than the water in that well. She asked him at the end of her first response, are you greater than Jacob, our father, who gave us this well? And he said, anyone who drinks this water will thirst again, but he that drinks the water that I will give him will never thirst, but that water that I shall give shall spring up within him as a fountain of living water. So, in other words, natural water is something that you have to repeatedly use to quench your thirst, because thirst is a recurring phenomenon, and therefore drinking water must be a recurring phenomenon. But he's talking about something that will be a constant supply, a fountain springing up continuously within, satisfying permanently a thirst that will never have to be intermittent. It will not be recurring, this thirst. It'll be over. As long as you have this fountain springing up within you, your thirst will be satisfied perpetually. And she still, maybe with a little less certainty, thought that he was talking about normal water. And she said, well, sir, give me this water so that I won't ever have to come out here and draw water again. There's a possibility that there was a note of irony in her statement. Skepticism, really. I mean, who wouldn't be skeptical if she thought he was talking about natural thirst and water, and that he had some kind of magic water that once you drink it, you never have to drink anymore? She would be naturally skeptical. unless she wasn't, unless she was just gullible. Some people were. I mean, not everyone was educated or sophisticated, and there were all kinds of magicians around, especially in Samaria. Philip ran into a very important magician in that very region later on in Acts chapter 8. But maybe she thought he was a magic man. He claimed to have some magic water. She wasn't sure. But she said, listen, whatever you're talking about, that sounds good to me. That would serve me well to have water that prevents or precludes my having to come back here all the time. Now, whether she had skepticism that he could really deliver, but she was just humoring him, or whether she was really interested but didn't understand him, it's very hard to read her at times. But he just said, go get your husband. Now, if she had been playing along with this whole water analogy all this time, and he was ready to change it up again and stop talking about water and get down to the matters of the kind of thirst his water would quench, which was, of course, that thirst within every person to be connected with their Creator. And that thirst exists most acutely in those who feel the alienation the most. All people who don't have Christ are alienated from God, and yet human beings are not made to be alienated from God. It's like being a machine that's made to run on a certain fuel, but the fuel's not there. There's something very significant missing, and that is felt by more sensitive people at their more sensitive moments. Not all of them know that it's God that they're lacking, but they know they're lacking something. And many people are on a continual quest to fill that thirst with something. Solomon, in the book of Ecclesiastes, enumerated many things that he had tried to, although he didn't use the word quench the thirst, certainly that's what he was talking about. He tried various things, education and philosophy and horticulture and music and women and money, and tried everything that really the world promises to bring some kind of satisfaction, but he found it to be unsatisfactory. He found it to be frustrating, like striving after the wind. It was emptiness, he said. And so in Solomon's case, we have a very good example of the desperation of a person who feels that hunger but does not know where to go to satisfy that thirst. This woman had apparently been seeking to satisfy that thirst in relationships with men. She had had at least 6 significant relationships, 5 of which were actual marriages, and the last of which she was actually living with a man. One might argue that it's not hard to find out what her self-medication of choice was, and yet she was no different than almost anyone else. The way in which people who don't know Christ differ from one another is not in that some are good and some are bad, or that some are satisfied and others are not, but simply in their choice of self-medication, self-treatment of that thirst, seeking to quench it. And Jesus knew that for her to understand what the living water was, she had to become aware of what the thirst was that he was talking about. And so he said, go get your husband. He knew she had no husband. The question was calculated to get her to mention the fact that she had no husband, and for him to be able to bring up this matter, which would focus like a laser beam on her spiritual hunger and thirst. And I believe that she did have spiritual thirst. I don't believe she was merely cynical, skeptical, and sarcastic with Jesus. I think she really, because of Jesus' openness with her and how much he told her, Jesus didn't waste his words on people who were not receptive. I think he found in her a person who really had the preparation of heart to be interested in what he was saying, and who had that thirst. If Jesus had not seen in her a thirst, he would have used probably some other analogy, some other approach to evangelism. He was addressing that which he saw in her. And that was something she was trying to satisfy, something she was trying to quench, and she had been trying to quench it apparently for many, many years, with several marriages, and even after she was done with marriage, with a relationship nonetheless. And so when he said, go get your husband, she simply said, I have no husband. She volunteered no other information. Perhaps the other information was something she wouldn't speak to strangers about, and may have had some embarrassment about, especially if, as I believe, she was feeling convicted and desiring to reconnect with God. That's the thirst that she had. A thirst for God, that she didn't know how to find him. And she said, I have no husband. Jesus said, that's right, you did say that correctly. You don't have a husband. You've had 5 husbands. And you have a man now, but he's not your husband. And in speaking that way to her, she instantly recognized he was not an ordinary man. She said, sir, I perceive you're a prophet. It's a little bit like when he said to Nathanael, I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you. And Nathanael said, you are the Son of God. I mean, Jesus was blowing people's minds continually with revealing things that they didn't expect him to know. This, by the way, phenomenon of being able to know things about people that you have no natural access to in terms of the information. Usually, this is a gift of the Spirit that I know Pentecostals and Charismatics identify this as the gift of word of knowledge. And they may be right, because there is such a gift named in the Bible in 1 Corinthians 12, when Paul begins to list the gifts of the Spirit, of which 9 are listed in that chapter. He mentions first the word of wisdom, then the word of knowledge, and then some others. Also prophecy is in the list, and others. And Paul never explains what he means by either word of wisdom or word of knowledge. The expressions are only found in that one passage, in a list. So they're not self-explanatory. So what does he mean by word of wisdom, word of knowledge? Modern Pentecostal and charismatic people think they know, and maybe they do, but they believe that the word of knowledge is this phenomenon that Jesus exhibited, that when God reveals to somebody facts about somebody else which are not available for that person to know naturally, when they have a supernatural insight into phenomena, or not phenomena, but facts about people, like Nathanael under the fig tree, or the woman's marital history. However, I don't know if that's the gift of word of knowledge. If it isn't, I'm not sure what Paul meant when he said the word of knowledge, but he didn't tell us what he meant, and therefore we can't be sure that this particular phenomenon is what he was referring to, because this particular phenomenon was already known in Israel. In the Old Testament, and this woman knew the name. You're a prophet. The ability to tell people things about themselves that were unlearned by the one revealing it was generally part of the gift of prophecy. Elisha had known that his servant Gehazi had gone and secretly made a deal to take money from Naaman the Syrian. And he revealed that he knew it. That was because Elisha was a prophet. And it seems like knowing such things are a function of the gift of prophecy, which is a separate gift than word of knowledge in Paul's list. So I don't know if this is the word of knowledge or if this is just the function of prophecy. She saw it as a prophecy. She said, sir, I see you're a prophet. And, of course, she was right, but not quite right. He was the prophet in Deuteronomy. Now, the Samaritan people only accepted the Torah, the first 5 books of our Old Testament. They didn't accept the other portions of the Old Testament that the Jews accepted. And so they didn't accept the prophetic books, or even the historical books as Scripture. They accepted only Moses' writings as Scripture. Now, because of that, the Samaritan religion did not anticipate any prophets except the Messiah to come. Because Moses had said in Deuteronomy 18, the Lord your God will raise up another prophet like myself. To him you shall heed, and he that does not listen to that prophet will be cut off from his people. And so there was this, not just a prophet, but the prophet par excellence, the ultimate prophet that Moses had predicted. We know from New Testament writings later on, from the book of Acts, Peter's sermon in Acts 3 and Stephen's sermon in Acts 7, both sermons refer to this prediction of Moses, that there'd be another prophet like Moses. And Peter and Stephen both identified this prophet with Jesus. So that because of them, we know that the prophet that Moses spoke of is also the same person that's the Messiah, because we know Jesus to be the Messiah as well. The Samaritans felt that too. They felt like that prophet would be the Messiah. The Jews didn't quite have that certainty, because when they came to John the Baptist, they said, are you the Messiah? He said, no. They said, are you Elijah? He said, no. They said, are you the prophet? meaning that prophet Moses spoke of. Now, he'd already said he wasn't the Messiah, so clearly the Jews weren't sure that that prophet was to be identified with the Messiah. But in the Samaritan religion it was. And they didn't really expect any prophets until the Messiah would come, the excellent prophet that Moses had spoken of. So when she said, "Sir, I perceive you're a prophet," as a product of Samaritan belief systems, it was to her, it would be consistent with her thinking that if he really was a prophet, he's probably the Messiah. In fact, later on when she says, "Well, I know when Messiah comes, he'll explain all this stuff," she may have been prying to see if he would say, "Well, that's me." And sure enough, he did. She may have meant the statement as sort of an invitation for him to reveal himself as the Messiah. But we're not there yet. Her first comment was, "Sir, I see you're a prophet." And then she begins to talk about religion. And that's really pretty much the subject Jesus wanted to get onto, because that's where her hunger was. Religion is the means by which people try to connect with God, try to reconnect with God, we might say, because people feel like this connection with God is somehow primordial and original in our state, but we've just lost it. We're not normal without it. It's something that we've somehow, it's slipped through our fingers and we're now alienated from somebody that we need to be reconciled with. But how do we get there from here? That's what religion is for. Go to the temple, offer a sacrifice, atone for your sins, get right with God. That's what religion is. But the Samaritans and the Jews had different religions and different temples in different locations. The Jews in Jerusalem had the temple that Solomon, well, not that temple, Solomon's temple had been destroyed, but it had been rebuilt on the same spot. Zerubbabel's and Herod's temple was there. That's where the Jews offered their sacrifices. The Samaritans had a different religion and a different location. Mount Gerizim, right there, where that well is in the shadow of Mount Gerizim, within view of it. And they had their temple there. And so she says, "Sir, I see you're a prophet. Let me see if you can settle a dispute for me. Our people say that we should worship God, offer sacrifices." That's what worship means. To the Jewish mind, to the ancient mind, worship means offer sacrifice. To us, worship means sing, pray, in some traditions, genuflect, whatever, just these ritual things that we do. There's no blood offered because we don't have blood sacrifices anymore. But in all ancient religions, including Judaism, worship meant specifically to offer sacrifices on an altar to God. And she said, our people say that we should worship, that is, offer our sacrifices here on Mount Gerizim. You Jews say otherwise. You say that Jerusalem's the place that men ought to worship. And so she's asking him for a decision about this. Now, as I said when we were talking about this previously, some people, as they're talking about this chapter, have the impression that the woman, upon Jesus mentioning her 5 previous marriages and her present situation, that she suddenly felt convicted and wanted to turn the light of his gaze off of her guilt and just almost desperately grasped at almost any subject she could to change the subject. And, what better than, to focus on the religious controversy between their two people, between their two nations. And so that this was a diversion she was throwing up. Let's see, never mind my husband's business, but where's the right place for us to worship? And some people treat this as if it was like just a shallow and sudden and almost arbitrary change of subject. But I don't think so. I think she was very much aware that she had become disconnected from God, and her lifestyle was what had disconnected her. I believe she was aware. They had the Pentateuch. She knew she had sinned. She knew she had fallen short. She knew that she wasn't living the way God would have her live, and therefore God would not be pleased with her. But she didn't know where to go to reconnect. And that was her thirst. That was her thirst that needed to be quenched, that Jesus had come to speak to her about. She's thirsting for God, but she doesn't know where to go to find him. Worship, here's a prophet for the first time. I'm the first person to run into a prophet in my lifetime. And here he is right here at this well. So could you settle this for me? And Jesus did. He said, "Woman, It doesn't matter who's right and wrong about that, because it's all going to change real soon. The hour is coming when no one's going to worship in Jerusalem or in Mount Gerizim. Jesus was continually in his ministry making predictions about the end of the Jewish system, and the Samaritan system ended at the same time, within 40 years of this, when the Romans destroyed both the temple in Jerusalem and the temple in Mount Gerizim, and neither has been built since. So no one worships at Jerusalem or at Mount Gerizim in the prescribed way anymore. Now you might say, but if you go to Israel today, don't the Jews worship in Jerusalem? Not in any way that the Bible prescribed. They don't have a temple. The only prescribed worship in the Old Testament is to offer animal sacrifices at the hands of a Levitical priest in a temple or tabernacle. They have neither. You go to Jerusalem now, there's no temple there. There has not been a temple there for almost 2,000 years. That system is gone. The fact that the Jewish people generally do not accept Jesus as the ultimate atoning sacrifice means that they are left without any atoning sacrifice. They don't have the animal sacrifices anymore either, and can't, because there's no temple. So Jesus was right. People are never going to worship in Jerusalem or in Samaria again in these locations. But he says it doesn't matter, because God's not looking for people who go to the right spot. He's looking for people whose hearts are right. God is seeking such as know how to worship him in spirit and in truth. He's not an ordinary God like the pagan gods, who just is delighted with animal sacrifices and ritual. He's delighted because he's spirit, Jesus says. He's delighted in spiritual things. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. They must, in other words, be inward in their worship, in their spirit, not just in external behavior, not just external ritual. And they must worship in truth, which means in genuineness, in honesty, in integrity. Unlike the hypocrites who put it all on as a show that Jesus often referred to. So he tells her it's not going to be any longer a matter of where you worship. It's just, it's how you worship. Is your worship internal or merely external? In other words, is it of the heart and of the spirit, or is it just outward show? Is it genuine, or is it play acting, like the Pharisees? He also said to her, you Samaritans don't know what you worship, but we Jews know what we worship, because salvation is of the Jews. So he did say, regardless where the right place to worship is, the Jews at least know who they're supposed to worship. Again, the Samaritan problem was not so much that they worshipped in the wrong place, but they didn't worship anyone that they knew. They didn't know who God was. The Jews had it over the Samaritans in that respect, but the Jews and Samaritans were both equally susceptible to the wrong kind of worship, ritualistic and hypocritical worship, as opposed to worship in spirit and in truth. And so, when he said these things to her, he was telling her that you can connect with God spiritually without having to worry where an animal sacrifice has to go. Because God is where you are. Wherever your spirit is, you can worship. Wherever you're honest and truthful, you can worship. Because God is there too. He's not confined to these locations, and it's a good thing too, because these locations are soon to be devastated and destroyed. So it's never really been about location. But God has met with people wherever they were humble, wherever they were honest, wherever they were submissive to him, wherever they loved him. That's where he has always been, and he accepted that kind of worship all forever. Joseph was a slave in Egypt, and God was there. Joseph wasn't in Jerusalem. Abraham was in Babylon when God met with him. Moses never did go to Jerusalem, but God was with him in the wilderness and everywhere he went. So God is wherever people are whose hearts are directed toward him. And so Jesus is saying, I'm glad I was able to disabuse you of this, because you've been disconnected from God and leaving this matter of your sin unresolved because you've been paralyzed by indecision about which way to go. Don't worry about either place. Just get your heart right. Just come to God genuinely and honestly with your whole heart. And the woman said to him, I know the Messiah is coming, who is called the Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. Of course, like I said, she might have been kind of baiting him to see if he was going to say he was the Messiah. If she was, well, He didn't disappoint her. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. And as I said last time, she's the only person on record to whom Jesus made that statement clearly. Many people don't realize that Jesus never went around publicly declaring he was the Messiah. Sometimes when you try to point out to people that Jesus is the Messiah because he fulfilled so many prophecies about the Messiah that were uttered in the Old Testament, sometimes a skeptic will say, well, you know, he just wanted people to think he was the Messiah. He knew what the prophets said about the Messiah, so he kind of engineered things so that he did things the way that they expected the Messiah to be, and therefore he convinced people he was the Messiah by artificially fulfilling these prophecies. Yeah, the only problem with that is it presupposes that Jesus somehow wanted to convince people he was the Messiah. I mean, that's the only way that particular explanation would hold any water. If Jesus was somebody, even if he wasn't the Messiah, but somebody who wanted people to think he was, then he might do that thing. Except he probably wouldn't. Because the things Jesus did were not the things people thought the Messiah would do. If he was an imposter trying to convince people he was the Messiah, he probably would have done a lot of different kinds of things. Like the things they thought the Messiah would do, instead of the things they didn't think he was going to do. He probably would have been like all the other false messiahs that came and went, who all did the same thing. Namely, tried to rally the people of Israel to throw out the Romans. That's what the Messiah was expected to do, and Jesus made no motions that direction. And in John 6:15, when Jesus saw that the crowds he had fed were about ready to forcibly take him and make him king, he sent them away and hid, because that wasn't what he was about. That was what they thought the Messiah was supposed to be about. It was not what he was about. Yeah, Jesus didn't act very much like a man would act if he was an imposter trying to convince people he was the Messiah. There were lots of those, and none of them acted the way he did. They all did what the people thought the Messiah should be. Jesus did what the Scripture said the Messiah would do. But what's more, there's no evidence anywhere in the Bible that Jesus ever tried to convince anybody that he was the Messiah. He didn't even tell his disciples. He asked them, who do you say I am? And when one of them said, you're the Messiah, he said, I'm glad you got that right. I wasn't so sure you knew. You know, he confirmed it. But he never publicly declared, I'm the Messiah, follow me. He did say, I'm the good shepherd of the sheep and some things like that, which people could connect with the idea of the Messiah. But yeah, we don't have any record of Jesus announcing his messiahship publicly. He did confirm it, as I said, at Caesarea Philippi when Peter said, you're the Messiah, and he also confirmed it under oath on trial before Caiaphas. Caiaphas said, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? And he adjured him in the name of God, because Jesus had been refusing to answer up to that point. And since, in order to honor the name of God, in whose name he was put under oath, he said, I am. Yeah, that's me. So, as far as we know, 3 times Jesus confessed to being the Messiah. Twice, when someone else said it, he confirmed it. This is the only time that he actually came out and said it to him, I'm the Messiah. So, it certainly makes me think this woman was not just some kind of a, garden variety, sinful, cynical, half-interested kind of individual. Jesus revealed himself to her in ways he didn't even reveal himself to his apostles. And he does not cast his pearls before swine, so he must not have judged her to be such. He must have seen that she was a person with genuine thirst, with genuine integrity, with a genuine desire. And if the only reason that commentators and preachers have made her out to be something other than a genuine and honest person is if it's because of her marriage history, that's not really very fair. That opinion of her, that assessment of her on that basis, which I think Christians often make, is so typical of religious people.